Hi everyone, I'm here with Russell Hamblin-Boone. He's the CEO of the CIVIA, which is the Civil Enforcement Association. Russell, thanks very much for joining me. And you're in charge of enforcement in England and Wales, right?
No, that's correct. It's good to be here.
I think to start off, I wanted to chat just a little bit about what are some of the latest developments in the enforcement world in terms of what are you seeing these days, particularly as we come out since the pandemic, I think, more than anything else, which must have had a big impact.
Yeah, it's actually 10 years since the taking control of goods regulations came into force. And they're the regulations that are effectively used to define and measure the work of enforcement firms and enforcement agents. But they were drafted 10 years ago. They don't really reflect modern enforcement practices. And voluntarily, the industry has taken on a reform program for which the regulations were, fair to say, they were the catalyst for the industry to get better. And that reform has included things like a new independently monitored code of practice. We established an independent panel to oversee complaints adjudication and the audit reports that firms get against the code. And then most recently, the biggest development, evolution in the industry has been the establishment of the Enforcement Conduct Board as an independent oversight body, which was launched a couple of years ago and is now starting to come into action and implement some of its plans. And we were big supporters of that being done in the way that it's been done, in collaboration with the debt advice sector, because we felt that there needs to be a more independent voice that looks at the industry and speaks for it based on evidence. Inevitably, the trade association is going to say one thing, the debt advice sector who are campaigning for changes are going to say another thing. But I think the interesting thing for the industry is that while we're regulated under Ministry of Justice regulations, we're now in a situation where enforcement firms are working to detailed rules-based regulation, which are very prescriptive, but at the same time, post-pandemic, are expected to respond flexibly to individual circumstances as if the regulations were principle-based. And that creates a kind of tension where public bodies and firms contracted to them have legal duties to recover debt, but firms are also under pressure to exercise what in the commercial sector you call forbearance, particularly for vulnerable people. And it puts a spin on what's reasonable and fair, where it has to apply to the taxpayer and to the person in debt.
Well, there were new rules that came out, was it last week? I think it was the government coming back in terms of reviewing around some of the rules around enforcement, but also debt collection within the local authority sector. I mean, what was your kind of take on those? Because it felt like the government response, it didn't seem to fully endorse all the recommendations that came out.
Yeah, I think there are two things to say there. First of all, it was looking at council tax collection. And I think given the sort of political environment that sort of we're in, with the sort of uncertainty where maybe no single party has that much political strength ahead of the election and things like that, certainly the governing party at the moment doesn't seem to have. So there was an opportunity to perhaps to say, look, let's just commit political suicide, reform the whole council tax system. We haven't reevaluated properties for 30 years. It's really probably not reflective of people's circumstances. So let's find a new way of doing it, even though it's going to be massively unpopular. But as the government, we're probably going to be out of office next time and maybe come back in 5 years' time, who knows? And those are rare opportunities that are going to come along when politically you could say, let's just do something that's for the good of the country, even though it's not good for our party. And that was a missed opportunity. So instead, you had the select committee come up with some sort of lightweight kind of recommendations around some stuff, around sort of data sharing and collections activity and trying to build some sort of affordability assessment into council tax payments. And of course, it's all kind of tinkering around the edges. A lot of it is already being done because we've had 30 years of having a go at this stuff and tweaking it, trying new things, and within the framework that's pretty rigid. And so, unsurprisingly, the government did come back and said, yeah, we've got data sharing pilots. We can't put so much forbearance into it that more and more people are not paying council tax, because we need council tax, especially post-pandemic. Councils have got holes in their budgets. And so we felt that it was a very politically driven inquiry that was never really going to come up with any substantive regulations that the government could run with.
It was interesting. It seemed like what they came back with didn't really seem to change much what the recommendations were from, I think it was from the select committee. So it almost felt like it was almost like it stopped in mid tracks to a certain extent, rather than being any kind of progress to one way or the other, if anything.
Yeah, there is some progress potentially in Wales, where they've had 2 consultations already on council tax reform, and they've got another consultation this year on council tax reduction schemes, where they're trying to look at, are there different ways of banding and trying to do things individually in the country that sort of they can do on a national level quite simply, and perhaps it could be pioneering, and perhaps it could pave the way for changes in England. But it's being driven by a concern that there's a problem with the way council tax is collected. And this is one of the challenges that you've got here, is that the easy target is the way it's collected, and enforcement agents, or as bailiffs as people call them colloquially, but it ignores the fact that council tax cases account for about 28% of civil enforcement work. 60% is penalty charge notices, sort of traffic and parking offences. But there's always a focus on how the council tax is collected, rather than further upstream as to where the problems might lie in terms of who's having to pay it and how they're having to pay it and what they're having to pay.
Yeah, it's almost like sometimes it almost like feels like they wait too late, and then it goes out to enforcement, and they're actually cleaning up the issues that are probably further upstream to a certain extent as much as anything. But obviously, there's the media around that, which is it does. Do you think that? Sorry, taking a step back, you talked about what's changed over the last year, and what some of the things where you think it has changed, and some of the issues which has gone away to a certain extent.
Yeah, I think that we've voluntarily introduced the Enforcement Conduct Board. So we've said, look, we're open to scrutiny, provided it's independent and provided it's evidence-based. We didn't want to get subsumed by, say, the Financial Conduct Authority and just be a sort of tiny part of a big organisation that didn't really understand us, and we needed to have some sort of oversight of a body that was specialist to our work, because people often have strong opinions about the work of enforcement, but they also have a very low level of knowledge about what we do. And so the industry itself has been transformed, particularly by the use of technology. All of the things that you see in a commercial debt collection agency, in terms of the use of technology, the use of credit reference agencies, all of that stuff is standard practice in the enforcement sector. We have the same challenges of trying to communicate with people, engaging people to start talking about their debts and find ways of resolving their debt. We have the same challenges, even greater challenges, in terms of understanding people's circumstances. It's often said, oh, the DCA is held up as a sort of an exemplar, but it doesn't acknowledge the fact that if you're an enforcement firm, you get an order from the court, and that will give you a name and address. It'll tell you what the debt's for and how much it is, and possibly give you a car vehicle registration number, and that's it. And that information will be months, possibly even years old, and that's your starting point. So you've got to, first of all, engage with that individual, and then start to gather as much information about them as you can to understand their circumstances. And that's incredibly difficult, particularly when it's people who owe debt and maybe don't want to pay it back. So it's often said that enforcement agents are heavy-handed, or they're not taking into account people's circumstances or whatever, or people complain and say an enforcement agent came and they didn't realise that my wife's suffering from this and I've got this and I've got. Of course we don't, because all we've got is a name and address, and tracing you down in the first place is a success. We can then listen to what you've got to say and try to understand circumstances. And what will happen is that if someone's identified as vulnerable and that's evidenced, then it will go back to the council for review, if it's council tax, possibly to other authorities that we work for, public bodies that we work for, to see whether the enforcement action should continue, or whether it should be suspended or stopped altogether. So it's really quite complex work that involves a number of processes: tracing people, engaging people, then trying to understand how you resolve their debt, and all at the same time making sure that you're being fair to the taxpayers who are funding this.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that definitely strikes me, particularly when you're doing one-to-one kind of visits, is just the richness of the information you get, right? So, for example, vulnerability and vulnerable situations, when you're actually standing outside someone's house, you can actually ascertain a lot more information than you would if you're just on a telephone or you're looking through a spreadsheet or getting trace kind of information. Is that fair in terms of like how you can actually gather the information and even feed some of that back? We talk about this data sort of centric kind of world we're moving into. Is that part of what people are thinking about?
Yeah, absolutely. There's no excuse for no alternative, better alternative than obviously being able to visit someone in their home and understand their circumstances. And I've shadowed enforcement agents, and I've seen how much information you can glean. And you sort of, enforcement agents are highly trained. They can make a judgment about whether someone's sort of playing them, or whether they're genuine in their circumstances. And I can give you lots of examples. Perhaps won't go into now, but the value of that, I think, is shown by the fact that voluntarily the industry has introduced a new stage into the enforcement process, which comes before there are any visits, but is itself a visit. Something they're offering up to councils is that they will have what they're calling a pre-compliance stage, where before they make any attempt to collect debt, they just try and find out the individual circumstances. So that might be visiting the property, just have a visit, not to collect any debt or anything, just to understand that individual's circumstances, to decide whether they're even able to pay their debt. It might be through sort of communications campaigns and things like that. So the first instance becomes, we just need to get a dialogue going with this person. Once we do that, we can then start to discern whether the individual is someone who needs help, is someone able to pay, someone not able to pay, or somebody for whom enforcement is appropriate, who's willfully not paying even though they're able to.
And would that typically the decision be made by the council, or would it be made by the enforcement agent?
Yeah, so enforcement firms are offering up this additional stage. Councils have got huge backlog of historic debt that was building up before the pandemic because of court delays and things like that. Has been exacerbated since the pandemic. Councils offered sort of people payment holidays. They suspended enforcement action. We voluntarily took our agents off the streets, recognising when we first started to understand the dangers of the pandemic and visits. But all of that has to be caught up with somehow. And that's where we're at the stage now, is councils are being much more analytical about segmenting different groups of people. Which people can we focus on because we know there's debt to be collected there? At the other end, which people do we know enough about to know that there's no way that they're going to be able to pay this, and perhaps we need to think about write-off policies or whatever else it is. So it's not a blanket approach, and they're looking to enforcement firms to use their expertise to help them work out the best way of approaching individuals' circumstances and trying to get through this backlog.
Yeah. What about things like body cameras has been in the news like recently, and you see them now even in things like the supermarket. I noticed the other day, right? They're so small. How prevalent is that now particularly in the enforcement industry in terms of using that, and what are some of the complexities that kind of introduces really?
Yeah, so we voluntarily mandated the use of enforcement of body-worn cameras for all enforcement agents that were in our membership. And then shortly after that, the Ministry of Justice made it compulsory for anybody working under the taking control of goods regulations to have to use body-worn video cameras. And we were promised that there would be guidance on top of that to offer some consistency as to how they used, and we worked with government sharing all of the kind of the individual company policies, but we haven't had any sort of consistent guidance yet. But we haven't had too much of an issue with data protection or privacy issues. We've got robust compliance procedures in place. Anyone can make a subject access request to see the data that's held on them, the film footage that's held for a limited time. And it also allows enforcement agents to be subject to quality control on the doorstep, because enforcement firms can do random checks on video footage, which they do. It means that we can review when there are complaints. We can easily review the evidence and see what happens in the truth of things. And it's really important because enforcement agents are representing public bodies, whether it's the local authority or HMCTS or whatever. So they have to maintain the highest standards, especially when they're engaging with the public. Body-worn video allows firms to be able to provide assurances to the central and local government departments that they're working on behalf of, that those standards are being maintained. I do think that body-worn video is a bit of a double-edged sword, though, because while it reduces spurious complaints, although you will get some people still claiming that the camera lies when they actually see how they've behaved on camera, it also presents a target for an agent if they're assaulted. The first thing that an assailant grabs for is the camera. But I think that on balance, enforcement agents appreciate the extra layer of protection that body-worn video provides. If you're a man or a woman knocking on someone's door and you're alone, and that person takes issue with your request for you to pay your debt, it's a potentially volatile situation. Most people are fine and they understand that these are people doing their job and that they owe the debt and everything else. But what we have seen since the pandemic is a rise in abuse and assaults, along with the retail sector and transport and hospitality sectors. It's what I call the fracturing of the social contract, which has happened since the pandemic, where people have given themselves permission to be less compliant, to challenge authority, sometimes quite sort of violently, and to stand up for what they believe are their own personal rights, which means that the rules don't apply to them in the same way. I don't know what the reasons for that is, but something has happened in the sort of psyche of society, which means that we can do things, we can break rules, we can apply rules in a way that suits our own purposes, which is a worrying trend.
So is that's something you've seen definitely from almost like before the pandemic to now, is it? So the rule, compliance to the rules or good behaviour in some ways has deteriorated.
Yeah, there was always an element of risk involved in the type of work that enforcement agents do, and that's body-worn video has helped that in many respects. But yeah, I mean, definitely since the pandemic, we work closely with the British Parking Association and what are called civil enforcement officers now, we would know as parking attendants or traffic wardens. They're seeing a rise in this. As you said, even in supermarkets, people wearing body-worn video. In my local cinema, in the foyer, the pick and mix, there's a sign saying, please don't abuse our staff. But the pick and mix. So yeah, I think there's something bigger going on and we have to respond to that. And firms are doing that as well. And one of the ways of doing that, I think we're seeing, is we're looking at a different pool for recruiting enforcement agents. It's much more about communications. So some of the best enforcement agents have worked in sort of sales and retail because they're good at building a rapport with people, as well as in other circumstances, recruiting from the police service or the prison service or whatever, people who've got that kind of conflict management background. And you have to have that mix now. Certain individuals are better at collecting certain types of debt. Council tax, which there's an overemphasis on, is the most sensitive, because generally if you're in debt with your council tax, it's through other circumstances. It's not usually something you've done yourself, not usually. Whereas penalty charge notices or court fines or something, you've deliberately done something that has meant you've broken the law and you've got a penalty for it.
So that's quite interesting in terms of like maybe a different segmentation in terms of also skills of the enforcement agent as well. So you've meant your book, depending on the type of debt maybe, or the type of work or the type of interaction you need to have with people who you're going to visit.
Yeah, and it already happens. High court enforcement officers do a different type of work. You've got bailiffs doing evictions and moving traveller sites and all that type of things, and they've got a different skill set to the guys who are knocking on people's doors saying, "Look, unfortunately, you haven't paid your council tax, and it's a priority debt, and I've got to find a way of resolving that with you." Yeah.
Yeah, I think the body cameras kind of piece is interesting in terms of like how does that in terms of the media noise around the industry is very different necessarily from what actually happens on doorsteps or actually happens in person, right? And
Yeah.
almost like trying to cut that down in terms of what the reality is versus what the narrative that everyone likes to talk about. And we see this in just more widely in collections as well, which is the reality on the floor is actually a lot different from what people think it is, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you would have thought that's starting to come close together, and body cameras help with that. But how much of a gap do you think we've still got around, particularly in the enforcement industry?
Yeah, I think it's if you're talking about a gap in understanding, there's definitely a gap. And then, however much you present the reality of what the work is,
Mm,
people have already got the preconceived opinion and are therefore trying to find evidence that fits their preconceived opinion as opposed
yeah,
to new information that you're telling them.
yeah,
We did a drop-in session for MPs in Parliament last year and just invited MPs and their staff to come along and talk to us, meet the bailiff type of thing.
mm,
And very few of them came along with any case studies or constituency issues. They all came along with an opinion about what they
mm,
thought we did and left with a completely different opinion, understanding that the kind of the logic of why would you act heavy-handedly or aggressively when your contract is dependent on your conduct and the standards of your service, because you're not just measured on how much debt you're collecting for the council or for the courts or whatever. You're also measured on how few complaints there are and what your customer experience is and the standards of conduct. All of those are metrics that go towards assessing whether you get your contract renewed. And
mm,
these are public contracts which are really valuable and highly competitive. So you've got to make sure that your business is of the highest standard, because you can bet your life that in a small industry, there's a competitor who will step in and say, we can do that. If they've made a mistake, we won't make that mistake. We've got no loyalty. We'll just get someone else to do the job. So it doesn't make sense to suggest that there are enforcement aid. There's bad in everything. I'm not an apologist in any way, but I will defend the majority of enforcement agents for doing their job in the best way possible in the most difficult circumstances, as I said, for a number of reasons, especially since the pandemic. And will continue to push back against the stereotype that people keep trying to pigeonhole us into.
mm. Do you think it's improving, or do you still think we've got a long way to go in terms of like stereotypes?
Yeah, if I don't say it's improving, then that's not a good reflection on me, is it? But I think there is this challenge of people who are open to it have their minds broadened when they start to understand the breadth of the work, the scale of the work. We work closely. The Ministry of Justice officials get it. The
Mm,
Enforcement Conduct Board, newly appointed staff, have been out shadowing enforcement agents. They've been visiting firms. They've been listening in the contact centres. So they're starting to get it. They start to understand it. It's not necessarily sort of easy viewing or easy listening. It's difficult work, and it's not necessarily light touch and soft and fluffy as everybody would like it to be. But if it wasn't, then you wouldn't be getting 40% of collection before a visit. You wouldn't get overall collection rates of around about 20%, sometimes higher, depending on the demographics of collecting really hard to collect debt. There's £5.5 billion worth of uncollected council tax alone, which would go a long way to sorting some of the public service challenges that we've got. I think that where people are directly engaged with us, you talk to any of the councils, you talk to any of the sort of the technology suppliers, they'll all say, do you know what, this industry is a good industry, it's a robust industry, and it's doing a good job. Those people who are on the periphery, and particularly those who see things through the prism of people with problems, will say it's outrageous. But we'll get back to body-worn video. Look at the body-worn video. Look at the low number of complaints.
How do you think that's going to change, particularly with things like the cost of living example or the energy price increase? It seems like we've got probably maybe like a slightly increasing new segment of people going into arrears, and there's like falling down. Is that changing the dynamics at all? Because you're coming across maybe new people who haven't seen it before versus people who've maybe come across the industry before. I mean, is that changing the dynamics, do you think?
I think that's a really good point, and the enforcement firms will say we are now starting to see people who aren't regularly in debt, perhaps have never been in debt, had problem debt, debt before, young people on lower incomes and things like that. And the industry has to adapt to those people, because if those people have got themselves so far down the line through all of the sort of attempts, let's say it's council tax, they've missed all of the kind of reminders, they've missed all of the efforts of the local authorities' attempts to help them sort this out, to the point that the council are now taking them to court and they're in the enforcement process. It's quite scary when you get that notice of enforcement that says the council's taken you to court and has now instructed us as bailiffs, enforcement agents, to come and recover your debt or take control of goods, because that's the bottom line, that's the law. But at the same time, we have to recognise that it might just be people who don't know how the system works and they don't realise that it's ended up like this. And so you have to take each case on its merits, and enforcement firms exercise what is the equivalent of forbearance, particularly around council tax. Again, we keep talking about council tax. There's lots of other debts that's collected for the government. And like child support payments, for example, is a good example of doing good for society. But yeah, I think that there has been firms have adopted adapted their approach to individual circumstances, and while it's still enforcement according to the regulations, there's a whole new sort of number of layers on top of that in terms of responsible
I suppose you're also at the point where if someone's been ignoring something or they've been sticking their head in the sand around addressing something for that long, maybe procrastinating about taking action, you can't change the past, but what you can do is standing there in front of them now about their penalty notice or whatever it is, look, we can help you going forward. We can't change what's happened before, but in the customer's mind, they're probably angry about all the stuff's gone before and they haven't done it and all of that, and you're having to deal with all of those things. But all you can do is address the best you can with what's going forward and like help them out of the situation.
Yeah, and it is necessarily enforcing. It's a forceful thing, particularly penalty charge notices. If your car gets clamped and then someone knocks on the door and says, "Look, I've clamped your car because you still haven't paid your whatever your fine is for, your parking fine, and I'm not going to release it until you pay your parking fine, or I'm going to take your car away." That's that feels heavy-handed. But actually, what's the alternative? Go around begging people to please pay up, creating more and more cost for local authorities or the taxpayer. And I suppose that's another point to make, is that the cost of enforcement agent is at no cost to the taxpayer or to the local authority. The fees for the work that we do are fixed by government and added to the debt that the person owes. So effectively, they pay for the work of the enforcement agent. And one of the reasons for doing that is to try to get them to pay earlier so they don't incur those costs of enforcement, because they've sorted the debt before it gets to that stage.
Well, very, very, very good. And so where do you think the industry goes from here, do you think? So I know we touched a little bit on data. What do you think's next? How do you see it changing over the next sort of like 5-10 years?
Yeah, I think data is probably the key. We've got our conference in April where data is a big part of that. And I suppose lots of sectors will say the same as well. But I think it's where you can combine the data that is held in the public sector with the way that data can be used in the private sector. And we're already seeing pilots where government departments like DWP are sharing their data with local councils, so local councils can understand a bit more about people's circumstances, the benefits they're on, and maybe adapt their collection responses accordingly. But I think where you bring AI into that into that equation, where you've got a lot of data, and AI can help you find better ways of using that data, whether it's, as I said, about segmenting individuals and into groups and tailoring your communications in the best way. We do a lot of work using behavioral science and trying to understand what are the best ways to prompt responses from people. Perhaps AI can be a part of that as we go forward. I think ultimately the fundamental process of enforcement agents visiting a property on the doorstep, collecting debt on behalf of local authorities and central government is not going to change. And the regulations will probably still be quite prescriptive about what that process involves, but there'll be a whole lot of flexibility around how firms compete to do that and convince councils that they can do it in the best way possible. And we're already seeing the adoption of AI. I talked about behavioural science, with the use of tech firms. They've embraced fintech on a huge scale to look at voice messaging and the type of language that you're using, all of those type of things to get over this issue of get someone to engage. Once you've got someone to engage, then you can start to collect all the information about them that you don't have at the start.
Yeah. I love this idea of almost like I don't know if you called it right, almost like the pre-enforcement visit, just to gather information around situation. I love that idea. But then it's also interesting around segmentation. Is no matter where you scratch the surface in terms of segmentation, you can always segment more. And there's different types of visits, probably for different types of debt, different types of situations. And it just allows you to probably get engagement quicker, really, which is really what you're trying to do, isn't it? Either to solve the situation or to enforce it to a certain extent.
Yeah, absolutely. Because the reality is that councils they're not resourced to cope to do the sort of forbearance that most people would want or are campaigning for, or that debt collection agencies are able to do, perhaps. And so enforcement agents are picking up the slack. If it was an ideal world, enforcement agents would only get cases that were appropriate for enforcement, and therefore the enforcement methods would result in debts being paid by people who needed to be pursued by enforcement agents. That isn't, and we would have less cases passed to us, but they would all be quality cases that you could make a living from. Instead, we have to, for want of a better term, sort the wheat from the chaff. And the chaff is all the work you put into it, but you're going to get no return. And then amongst those, you're going to get a few nuggets where it's actually quality work that you're going to be able to make get a revenue from.
Yeah,
it's the reality of it, because we have such huge amounts of problem priority debt.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as always, it's like you drill into these things, and it's fascinating, right? Just as more you get into it, the more you can see the layers of how everything lays out. And as you said, I think obviously the reality of what's going on is very different from what people might perceive as well. So I appreciate you taking the time to explain that to us, and also where it's going as well. The whole industry's going as well. So Russell, thanks very much.
You're very welcome.